Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nolly, I too, I grew up in the South where paper mills are plentiful. In fact, my dad worked in a paper mill. He didn't have a degree. He was just a laborer. He worked in a paper mill for over 35 years. And the best thing he ever did for me after my freshman year in college was to put me to work on a broke beater. You know what a broke beater is?
I'm not sure.
Well, it's at the end of the process. It's where all the excess paper goes.
broke
and you,
comes out.
Yeah, and you just take it and you assemble it and you put it back and then you recycle it, per se. But I can tell you that it was as close to hell as I've ever been. I have never been that close. But I could not get to school quick enough. I could not get back to school and study hard quick enough, I will tell you that. It was a life lesson. Air quality was important to us. People would visit us and they'd say, "What's that smell?" And we'd say, that's money you smell," because that's what it was for us. But it is important, and I understand that. But I want to try to understand. Tell me what project netting is. What essentially is that?
So basically what we want to make sure we have is a system when we do the math and we look at a project to see if it results in a significant emissions increase. If it does, then by all means, let's go through the heightened scrutiny. Let's put on best controls if that's indeed the case. But when we do the math, let's look at the increases and decreases together so we don't wind up getting the project gummed up in the works, delayed, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on consultant studies just to get to the obvious answer that when there's not a real significant emissions increase, we should be putting this into NSR. We ought to go forward with the project, and because these are beneficial projects. And one point I'd like to make is, I think one thing that's being lost is when a regulatory program inhibits efficiency improvements at one facility, it's doing that all around the country for a bunch of them. So when we have demand X to meet, we're going to do it as a nation in a more inefficient and higher polluting way. When we can get these efficiency improvements in, by nature, we're going to have not only less CO2, but other pollutants as well.
Okay, I've heard the process. Tell me how we reform the process. Tell me what we do differently from what we're doing now that makes it practical and sensible, because that's what we all want to get to.
Sure, and some of the things I've mentioned, these are things EPA can do either through guidance or through rulemaking. There are some things Congress can do. Mr. Homestead mentioned some of them. Ones I would like to highlight is we would like to ensure that clean units have legislative support. So in other words, an emission unit that's been through the permitting process to have best controls put on it, that ought to be only an increase in the unit's permitted allowable emissions would trigger NSR. For pollution control projects, those need legislative support, and they're excluded under the New Source Performance Standards program. It makes sense to do the same thing in the NSR program, we believe.
Great. Well, Mr. Nolly, I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for what the paper industry did for me and for my family. It provided us a living.
Well, Congressman, if I could just briefly thank you and Mr. Olson, and I'm glad to hear you have a connection to the industry. Our workers are up here visiting many of your offices
Yes,
this
they
week.
are.
I hope you get to meet them. And these are very proud, hardworking people.
Absolutely.
And they're not asking for anything from any of you other than the right to compete in this country. They can beat anyone in the world as long as they are given a playing field that's workable. No one's here asking you to take controls off projects that ought to have emissions controls. We just don't want the delay and the unnecessary red tape that is gumming up our modernization.
Thank you, Mr. Nolly. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and the chair and I recognize the gentleman if he's ready.